The ink was still wet on the ledger when Samuel Giddings, the senior partner at Giddings and Associates, finally set his pen down on the afternoon of October 2nd, 1856. For 2 grueling days, the attorney had labored in the dim light of his Vicksburg office, transforming the rambling, feverish dictates of Cornelius Van Dorn into binding legal prose. The atmosphere in the room had been suffocating, heavy with the scent of laudanum and the approaching certainty of death. Outside, the Mississippi River flowed with an indifference that mocked the turmoil taking place within these 4 walls. Giddings reviewed the final stipulations one last time, his eyes narrowing at the sheer audacity of the requests. He had practiced law in Warren County for 3 decades, yet he had never committed to paper a document so certain to ignite a conflagration. With a heavy sigh, he reached for the red wax, knowing that the moment he sealed this envelope, the fate of Briarfield Plantation would be set on an irreversible course toward destruction. Cornelius Van Dorn lay propped against a mountain of pillows in the master bedroom of his estate, his breathing shallow and labored, as the consumption continued its relentless march through his lungs. He was a man unmaking his own legacy, driven by a late-hour desperation that terrified the few servants who tended to him. The planter had spent a lifetime building a reputation as a titan of the cotton industry, a man whose word was law in the rich bottomlands south of the city. Yet, as the shadows of his final days lengthened across the floorboards, he seemed less concerned with his standing among the living and more terrified of the judgment awaiting him beyond. He had dismissed his wife, Eleanor, from the room hours ago, unable to meet her gaze while he plotted a course that would effectively strip her of the life she had built for over 2 decades. The dying man's eyes were feverish, but his mind remained terrifyingly sharp, dissecting his assets with the precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy on his own soul. "I want it stated plainly, Samuel," Cornelius rasped, his voice a mere ghost of the booming command it once was. "I do not leave this as a gift, for a man cannot give what he has already stolen." The attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, dipping the nib of his pen into the inkwell once more to capture these strange, moralizing codicils. The document was evolving into something more than a simple transfer of property. It was becoming a confession, a public admission of guilt that would scandalize the entire planter class from Natchez to Jackson. Cornelius insisted on specific language regarding his mental state, anticipating the inevitable challenge from his kin. He wanted the record to show that he was not mad, but rather burdened by a clarity of conscience that had eluded him during his healthy years. The irony was palpable. A man seeking redemption through the very legal mechanisms that had enabled his sins in the first place. The final clause to be transcribed dealt with the liquidation of the cotton factoring interests and the railroad shares that constituted the bulk of the Van Dorn fortune. Cornelius dictated the figures with unerring accuracy, proving that his faculties remained intact despite his wasting body. He allocated specific sums for the establishment of a trust, the mechanics of which were designed to circumvent the restrictive black codes of Mississippi. Giddings felt the weight of history pressing down upon him as he wrote out the name of the primary beneficiary, a name that would soon be on the lips of every gossip in the county. It was a risk to even draft such a will, and the attorney knew that his own reputation would be dragged through the mud alongside his client's memory. Yet there was a solemn duty in the law, a duty to execute the final wishes of the dying, no matter how incendiary those wishes might prove to be. He finished the page with a flourish, the scratch of the pen sounding like a match striking in a dark room. Historical archives from the Warren County Courthouse reveal that the meeting concluded with the signing of the testament in the presence of 2 junior clerks who acted as witnesses. They signed their names with trembling hands, aware that they were authenticating a document that would upend the social order. The date recorded was October 4th, 1856, a Tuesday that would live in local infamy. Cornelius Van Dorn summoned the last of his strength to scratch his signature at the bottom of the page, the ink blotting slightly under the weight of his weak hand. He then fell back against the pillows, exhausted but seemingly at peace for the first time in weeks. The document was folded, sealed with red wax bearing the Van Dorn family crest, and entrusted to Giddings for safekeeping. It was a Pandora's box, locked away in a leather satchel, waiting for the moment when it would be opened to unleash chaos upon the unsuspecting. In the hallway outside the study, Eleanor Van Dorn waited, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed her mounting anxiety. She had heard the murmur of voices late into the night, and wondered what secrets her husband was entrusting to the lawyer. As a woman of her station, she had been raised to believe that certain matters were the exclusive domain of men, and she had perfected the art of the dignified blind eye over 23 years of marriage. She adjusted the lace at her wrists, her thoughts drifting to the future of her 4 children and the vast acreage that was their birthright. It never occurred to her that the foundation of her world was about to crumble, for she could not conceive of a reality where her husband would betray the fundamental laws of their society. She nodded curtly to Giddings as he departed, noting the grim set of his jaw, but choosing to interpret it as grief rather than complicity. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into the grave. Cornelius Van Dorn lingered for nearly 6 weeks after the will was finalized, his body refusing to surrender quickly. During this time, the plantation operated in a strange state of suspension, as if the very air held its breath. The enslaved workforce moved through their daily tasks with a quiet intensity, sensing the shift in the household's energy. Among them, a woman named Cora Lee moved with a heavy burden of knowledge, for Cornelius had summoned her to his bedside 3 days prior to his death. In that private, whispered conversation, he had confirmed what she had suspected, but dared not hope for. That the legal document waiting in Giddings' safe was meant to alter the trajectory of her existence and the lives of her 3 children. It was a secret she guarded with a terrifying vigilance, even as the master's health deteriorated. On the morning of November 18th, 1856, the bells of the Episcopal Church in Vicksburg tolled to mark the passing of Cornelius Van Dorn. The planter had succumbed to the consumption that had plagued him for months, leaving behind a widow, 4 children, and a sprawling empire of cotton and rail lines. The local newspapers immediately launched into obituaries praising his business acumen and his contributions to the state's agricultural prominence. He was eulogized as a pillar of the community, a man who had tamed the wilderness and built a monument to Southern prosperity. Yet, beneath the polished surface of these public tributes, there was a current of unease among those who had been close to the man. They had seen the changes in him during his final year, the introspection that bordered on obsession, and the way his gaze would linger on the quarters behind the main house, with an expression that looked disturbingly like remorse. The funeral service was a grand affair, befitting a man of Cornelius's stature, drawing planters and politicians from across the region to Briarfield. Black bunting draped the columns of the great house, and the parlors were filled with the scent of lilies and the murmur of condolences. Eleanor sat in the front pew, draped in black crepe, her children arranged beside her like statues of grief. She played her role to perfection, the dignified widow accepting the sympathies of her peers, but a sharp-eyed observer might have noticed the tension in her shoulders. She was already calculating the future, secure in the knowledge that as the surviving spouse, she would oversee the management of the estate until her sons came of age. She had no reason to suspect that the funeral arrangements would be the last decisions she would make regarding the property she called home. By the afternoon of November the 21st, the formalities of mourning had begun to transition into the practicalities of succession. The relatives who had gathered for the funeral remained at Briarfield, their presence filling the house with a low hum of expectation. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions about the division of assets and the future of the holdings. Eleanor's brother-in-law, Silas Van Dorn, a prominent attorney from Jackson, had taken charge of the logistical arrangements. He moved through the house with an air of authority, assuming that the probate process would be a mere formality. He had already drafted a preliminary inventory of the estate, prepared to file it with the county clerk, and was looking forward to returning to his own practice. He had no idea that a sealed envelope, resting in a safe across the river, was about to render all his preparations irrelevant and plunge the family into a war that would last for years. To understand the legal explosion that would soon rock Warren County, one must first rewind the clock to a humid afternoon in May of 1844. It was then that Cornelius Van Dorn first laid eyes on the woman who would eventually become the central figure in the scandal. He had traveled to a liquidation auction on the outskirts of Vicksburg, seeking skilled labor for his expanding operations. The seller, a Virginia planter looking to offload assets before moving west, presented a group of field hands and house servants for inspection. Among them stood a young woman of 20 years, listed on the manifest as Cora Lee. She was described in the bill of sale as literate and trained in household management, attributes that made her exceptionally valuable in a society that actively suppressed education among the enslaved. The bidding was brisk, but Cornelius was determined, eventually securing her for the staggering sum of $1,800, a price point that raised eyebrows among the other planters in attendance. Cora Lee's arrival at Briarfield signaled an immediate shift in the plantation's internal dynamics. She was installed not in the crowded quarters of the field workers, but in a small room adjacent to the main house's kitchen. Eleanor Van Dorn, the mistress of the estate, viewed the purchase with a mixture of relief and suspicion. While she welcomed the help in managing the complex accounts of the household, she resented the exorbitant price her husband had paid. Diaries recovered from the estate's archives reveal Eleanor's initial entries regarding Cora, describing her as competent but proud, and noting that Cornelius spent an unusual amount of time explaining the ledgers to her. Within 6 months, the new housekeeper had reorganized the entire supply system, catching errors that had cost the plantation hundreds of dollars. Her proficiency became her armor, a way to make herself indispensable in a world where her existence was entirely dependent on the whims of others. The professional relationship between Cornelius and Cora began to blur during the harvest season of 1845, with Eleanor increasingly retreating into the social obligations of her class and claiming a distaste for the filthy business of numbers. Cornelius began holding his evening reviews in his private study. He would summon Cora to go over the cotton yields, railroad dividends, and purchasing ledgers. These sessions, which started as purely instructional, gradually extended later into the night. Historians point to the fall of 1845 as the turning point, noting a distinct change in Cornelius's correspondence. His letters to business associates began to reference a trusted advisor in the house, a phrase that coded a relationship far more intimate than master and servant. By the winter of that year, the power dynamic had warped into something complex and destructive, laying the groundwork for the tragedy to come. The first undeniable proof of the shift in their relationship arrived in June of 1846 with the birth of a son. The child was named Nathan, and his arrival sent a ripple of silence through the plantation's hierarchy. The plantation's midwife, an enslaved woman named Aunt Delilah, would later testify that the baby's features were unmistakably those of the master. He had the Van Dorn jaw and the same sharp eyes, she recounted decades later. There wasn't a soul in the quarters who didn't see it, and there wasn't a soul in the big house who dared speak of it. Eleanor's reaction to the birth was a study in the art of denial. She did not rage, nor did she demand the child be sold away. Instead, she simply erased the event from her consciousness, treating the child as if he were invisible, a phantom to be ignored rather than confronted. This act of willful blindness became the defining strategy of Eleanor's life for the next decade. Correspondence from 1847, discovered in a trunk in the Vicksburg Historical Society, hints at the chilling arrangement that had taken hold. In a letter to her sister in Charleston, Eleanor wrote, "I have found that peace is maintained not by open warfare, but by the careful management of one's attention. I do not see what disturbs me, and thus it ceases to exist." She continued to play the role of the gracious hostess and devoted wife, attending church socials and dinner parties with Cornelius by her side. To the outside world, the Van Dorns were a pillar of stability, but within the walls of Briarfield, a parallel family structure was solidifying, one that challenged the very racial and moral codes the white family claimed to uphold. The family in the shadows continued to grow, deepening the complexity of the deception. A daughter, Louisa, was born in 1849, followed by another son, James, in 1852. Each child bore the telltale markers of their paternity, light skin and features that mirrored the legitimate Van Dorn heirs. Cornelius's behavior grew bolder with each birth. He arranged for a larger cabin to be built for Cora and the children, one with glass windows and a raised floor, amenities usually reserved for white overseers. He also began to openly provide for the children's education in direct violation of Mississippi law. Primers and mathematics textbooks were found in Cora's quarters, and it was an open secret among the house staff that Cornelius himself spent hours teaching Nathan to read and write, investing in the boy with the same rigor he applied to his legitimate son. While Cornelius nurtured his second family, the distance between him and Eleanor became a chasm. The intimate life of their marriage had effectively ceased after the birth of their youngest legitimate child in 1841. For 15 years, they occupied the same house as strangers, bound only by property and social convention. Eleanor's diary entries from the early 1850s are marked by a profound, dry fatigue. She wrote often of the burden of maintaining appearances and the weariness of a silent vigil. She channeled her energy into her children and the church, while Cornelius retreated further into his private world with Cora. The arrangement was a powder keg, held together only by the rigid social protocols of the South, which dictated that a wife endure her husband's indiscretions in silence rather than risk the scandal of a public reckoning. The economic landscape of the 1850s further complicated the domestic situation at Briarfield. As the railroad expanded and cotton prices soared, Cornelius's wealth multiplied, and with it, the size of Cora's hidden domain. She was not merely a mistress in the traditional sense. She had become the financial linchpin of the estate. Court records from the subsequent trial would reveal that Cora Lee was the one who actually balanced the ledgers, negotiated with suppliers, and tracked the complex web of debts and credits that kept the plantation solvent. Cornelius trusted her intellect far more than he trusted his own wife's capabilities. This dependency created a perverse form of respect between the two, a bond forged in the fire of their twisted circumstances. He relied on her to maintain the empire that would eventually become the subject of his final, devastating act of conscience. However, the stability of this double life began to fracture in early 1856. Cornelius received his diagnosis of consumption, and the reality of his mortality stripped away his ability to delay difficult decisions. The man who had been content to live a lie for a decade suddenly found the deception intolerable in the face of eternity. His illness provided him with a unique form of freedom, a release from the fear of social judgment. As his physical strength waned, his determination to make right what he viewed as a lifetime of theft intensified. He began to speak openly to his attorney, Samuel Giddings, about the crimes he had committed against Cora and their children, signaling a radical shift in his thinking that would soon horrify his white family. Cora Lee watched the approach of death with a mixture of terror and anticipation. She knew that her position and the safety of her children relied entirely on the whim of a man who was about to leave the earth. In the South, the death of a master often meant the disintegration of his shadow family, with children sold off to settle debts and mistresses discarded to the streets. She had lived with this fear hovering over her like a storm cloud for years, wondering if Cornelius's affection would translate into protection. The night he finally summoned her to his bedside to reveal his plans, the air in the room was thick with the scent of camphor and impending change. It was the moment where the secrets of the past decade would finally crystallize into a weapon of mass destruction. By the time Cornelius Van Dorn prepared to dictate his final testament in October of 1856, the stage was set for a confrontation of epic proportions. He was a man standing on the precipice, looking back at a life built on the twin pillars of exploitation and genuine affection. Eleanor waited in the parlor, secure in her ignorance, while Cora waited in the shadows, armed with a dangerous knowledge. The social contract of the antebellum South required that such arrangements remain invisible, that the children of such unions remain nameless property, and that wives remain willfully blind. Cornelius's decision to break this silence was not merely a legal maneuver, but a grenade thrown into the very heart of his family's future. The morning of November the 21st, 1856, arrived with a heavy frost that clung to the windows of Briarfield, mirroring the chilled silence within the estate. The formal mourning period had concluded, and the reading of the will was scheduled for 10 o'clock, a procedural formality that the family expected to conclude before lunch. Eleanor Van Dorn sat in the central parlor, surrounded by her 4 children and a collection of relatives who had lingered after the funeral, their presence a testament to their interest in the vast inheritance. The room was a study in Victorian gloom, draped in black crepe and smelling faintly of the lilies that had yet to wilt. Attorney Samuel Giddings entered with a leather satchel clutched tightly to his chest, his face pale and drawn, signaling to any astute observer that this meeting would be anything but routine. He arranged his papers on the small table at the front of the room, avoiding the expectant gazes of the legitimate heirs, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to shatter their world. Silas Van Dorn, Cornelius's younger brother, and a man of significant legal standing in Jackson, cleared his throat to break the uncomfortable silence. He viewed this gathering as a necessary bureaucratic hurdle before the family could return to the business of managing their wealth. "Let us proceed, Samuel," he stated, his voice commanding the room with the assurance of a man accustomed to dictating terms. "We are all anxious to see the estate settled and ensure my sister-in-law is provided for." He nodded toward Eleanor, who sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped in her lap. There was an air of impatience in the room. The Van Dorn children were already calculating the value of their shares, confident that the vast cotton empire would be divided among them according to the traditions of primogeniture and dower rights. They had no reason to suspect that the document before them contained anything other than the standard legalese of the era. Giddings unfolded the heavy parchment, the crackle of the paper sounding like a gunshot in the hushed room. He began by reading the preamble, confirming the soundness of mind of the testator and the revocation of all previous wills. This initial section passed without incident, lulling the family into a false sense of security. Eleanor's posture relaxed marginally as she listened to the familiar legal cadences, perhaps hoping that the whispers she had ignored for years would remain buried. The attorney's voice, however, grew tighter as he approached the specific bequests. He paused, took a sip of water from a glass on the table, and steeled himself for the revelation he was legally bound to deliver. The tension in the room shifted from boredom to a sharp, alert watchfulness as the attorney turned the page. "To my wife, Eleanor Van Dorn," Giddings read, his voice dropping to a strained whisper, "I leave the sum of $1. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room, followed by a moment of absolute, stunned paralysis, Eleanor's face drained of color, her composure cracking like porcelain under a hammer. $1, she repeated, her voice shrill and unsteady. There must be a mistake. Cornelius would not. But Giddings continued, his eyes fixed on the paper, unable to meet the eyes of the widow. To my sons, William and Thomas, I leave the sum of $1 each. To my daughters, Sarah and Mary, I leave the sum of $1 each. The numbers hung in the air, insulting and incomprehensible, reducing a lifetime of accumulation to a pittance. The legitimate heirs of Briarfield had been disinherited in a single, devastating sentence. Silas surged to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the wooden floor. "This is absurdity," he shouted, slamming his hand onto the table. "My brother was a wealthy man, one of the richest planters on the river. Where is the rest of it? Where is the money?" He turned on Giddings with a predatory glare, accusing the attorney of fraud or forgery with his eyes. "Samuel, if this is some jest, it is in the poorest possible taste. My brother had assets exceeding $500,000. He owned thousands of acres. You cannot tell me he left it all to the church or some charity." The room descended into chaos, with the Van Dorn children shouting over one another, demanding answers that the attorney was terrified to provide. The social order of the household was collapsing in real time, and the panic was palpable. Giddings raised a hand, silently begging for silence, though his own nerves were visibly fraying. "Please, let me continue," he stammered, his voice barely audible above the uproar. "There is a primary bequest." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "To Cora Lee, a woman of color currently residing at Briarfield, I grant immediate and unconditional freedom." The name struck the room like a physical blow. The shouting stopped instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Every person in that parlor knew the name. They knew who she was, what she represented, and the secret they had all conspired to ignore. Eleanor's hands gripped the arms of her chair, so tightly her knuckles turned white, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the reality of her husband's betrayal was finally forced into the open. The attorney continued reading, his voice gaining a grim momentum now that the dam had broken. "Furthermore, I bequeath to the aforementioned Cora Lee the entirety of Briarfield Plantation." He listed the assets in a rapid, clinical stream. The 2,800 acres of prime bottomland, the steam-powered gin house, the livestock, the tools, and the extensive railroad stock. The scope of the bequest was staggering, transferring economic power that rivaled the most prominent families in the state. Giddings did not stop there. He read the clauses regarding the liquid assets, the bank deposits, the bonds, and the currency held in the Vicksburg vaults. Cornelius Van Dorn had not merely provided for his mistress, he had installed her as the matriarch of the estate, effectively demoting his white family to the status of paupers on the land they had once called their own. The revelation of the land transfer was only the beginning of the horror for the assembled family. Giddings moved to the final codicils, his voice cracking on the words that would strip away the last veneer of their social standing. "I declare that the following children, Nathan, Louisa, and James, are my natural offspring," he read, the words hanging heavy in the air like a verdict. "They are to be freed immediately and provided for from the estate." The acknowledgement of the mixed-race children was an act of supreme social violence against the white heirs, It was an admission of paternity that could not be whispered away or ignored. Eleanor stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused, as if she had been physically struck. The children she had pretended did not exist were now legally recognized as the primary recipients of her husband's legacy, their existence validated in a court of law. The silence that followed the reading of the children's names was more terrifying than the previous shouting. Silas Van Dorn stood motionless, his face a mask of calculated fury, his mind already racing toward legal remedies. The legitimate children sat in stunned disbelief, their inheritance evaporated, their social standing precarious now that the family secret was a matter of public record. The document on the table was no longer just a will. It was a declaration of war. It challenged every assumption of the antebellum South regarding race, property, and legitimacy. The foundation of their world had not just cracked, it had been obliterated by a dead man's conscience. The realization settled over them that this was not a mistake to be corrected, but a deliberate act of destruction orchestrated by the patriarch they had just buried. Eleanor finally found her voice, a low, dangerous sound that cut through the room. "Where is she?" she asked, her tone void of the hysteria that had gripped her moments earlier. "Where is this woman who has stolen my life?" She stood up, her mourning dress rustling as she turned toward the door, looking for a target for her rage. She was no longer the grieving widow. She was a woman fighting for her survival, and she was prepared to tear down the house to secure it. The family's shock was rapidly transforming into a weaponized anger, focused entirely on the woman who had been named in the document. They needed someone to blame, someone to hate, and the will had provided a name. Before anyone could respond to Eleanor's demand, a soft but firm voice answered from the doorway. "I am here." The assembly turned as one, their eyes falling upon Cora Lee. She stood on the threshold of the parlor, dressed in a simple gray dress, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. She did not cower or bow, but stood with the dignity of a woman who had already endured the worst the world could offer. Her presence was the final stroke of Cornelius's plan, the physical manifestation of the chaos he had unleashed. The confrontation that would define the next decade of their lives was now inevitable, played out in the solemn parlor of Briarfield. The atmosphere in the parlor shifted instantly from stunned silence to a cacophony of outrage as Cora Lee crossed the threshold. Eleanor Van Dorn surged forward, her hand raised, as if to strike the woman who had just been named the wealthiest landowner in the county. "You have no right to be here," Eleanor hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of hatred and panic. "This is my house. These are my children. You are a thief hiding behind a piece of paper." Cora stood her ground, her eyes locked with Eleanor's, refusing to show the fear that certainly churned beneath her calm exterior. The witnesses, a collection of Vicksburg society elites, shrank back against the walls, horrified yet transfixed by the collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet on equal terms. The formal reading had ended. The battle for Briarfield had begun. Silas Van Dorn stepped forward, inserting himself between the two women with the cold calculation of a man who viewed the law as a weapon. He looked at Cora, not with the rage of a betrayed relative, but with the clinical disdain of a prosecutor examining a piece of evidence. "This performance changes nothing," Silas declared, his voice booming with the authority of the courthouse. "You may have manipulated a dying man, Miss Cora, but you have forgotten where you are. You are in Mississippi, not some northern abolitionist fantasy. No court in this state will allow a Negro, freed or not, to inherit an estate of this magnitude. You have won nothing but a one-way ticket back to the fields." He turned to Attorney Giddings, his finger jabbing the air. "We will contest this monstrosity. We will bury you in litigation until you have not a penny left to your name." The children of Cornelius Van Dorn, both legitimate and unacknowledged, stood as silent witnesses to the unfolding war. Nathan, the eldest son of Cora, stood slightly behind his mother, a tall boy of 10 who watched the White family with a wariness far beyond his years. Across the room, William and Thomas, the legitimate heirs, glared at their half-brother with undisguised venom. The collision of these two lineages was a physical manifestation of the South's deepest fear, the collapse of the racial hierarchy that underpinned its economy. The vast difference in their futures had been legislated by the stroke of a pen, but blood ties were undeniable. The resemblance between the Van Dorn men and the mixed-race boy was too striking to ignore, a genetic truth that the shouting could not silence. Eleanor turned her attention to Attorney Giddings, demanding an explanation for the legal mechanism that had allowed this treachery to occur. "How could you, Samuel?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "You sat in this house, you ate at our table, and you helped him destroy us." Giddings, trapped by his professional duty and his personal fear, could only stammer a defense. "I advised him against it, Eleanor. I told him the law was ambiguous, but he was lucid. He knew precisely what he was doing. He dictated every word." The admission that Cornelius had been of sound mind was a crushing blow to Eleanor's hope that this could be dismissed as the rambling of a delirious man. It forced her to confront the terrifying reality that her husband had consciously chosen to dismantle his legacy. Cora finally spoke, her voice steady but low, cutting through the noise of the argument. "I did not write this will, Mrs. Van Dorn. I did not ask for this house. Your husband made these decisions because they were his to make." The statement was a simple recitation of fact, but in the context of the antebellum South, it was a radical act of defiance. By asserting that Cornelius's will was his own, she was claiming a right to exist and to own, a concept that threatened the very foundation of the slave-holding society. Eleanor recoiled as if she had been slapped, the reality of her husband's agency striking her harder than any physical blow could. The myth of the helpless master, manipulated by his slaves, was dissolving, leaving only the brutal truth of his choices. Silas Van Dorn moved quickly to seize control of the narrative. He signaled to the white witnesses, drawing them into a circle of solidarity that excluded Cora and Giddings. "You have all heard this absurdity," he announced. "This document is a fraud on its face. It violates the public policy of Mississippi. I need you to stand with the family when we file the petition tomorrow." He was mobilizing the social infrastructure of Vicksburg, turning the weight of the community against a single woman. The witnesses, many of whom owned plantations themselves, and feared the precedent this will might set, nodded in eager agreement. The legal machine was already beginning to grind into motion, designed to crush the anomaly that had invaded their parlor. The argument turned to the specific question of the other enslaved people on the plantation, a detail that had been overlooked in the initial shock. Silas pointed out the fatal flaw in Cornelius's generosity. "Even if the court allows her to keep the land," he sneered, "she cannot own the hands. A free Negro cannot hold slaves in this state. The workforce will have to be sold, and the proceeds will go to the rightful heirs." He was trying to salvage a victory from the wreckage, arguing that without the enslaved labor to work the fields, the land itself was worthless to Cora. It was a cold, economic assault, reminding everyone that the true currency of the South was human flesh, not soil. Cora's expression hardened at the mention of the people she had lived among for over a decade. She knew every family in the quarters, had nursed their children, and had managed their meager rations. "Those people are my friends and my neighbors," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Your brother wanted them to stay." But Silas laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "They are property, girl, chattel, and they will be liquidated to pay the debts of this estate, debts that your inheritance will undoubtedly incur." The legal reality of the situation was closing in. The will's provisions regarding the enslaved workforce were the weakest link in Cornelius's armor, and Silas intended to drive a wedge through it. As the confrontation escalated, the sheer impossibility of Cora's position became clear. She was standing in a room full of people who despised her, dependent on a legal system designed to keep her in chains. Eleanor, seeing an opening, attempted to reassert her dominance as the mistress of the house. "You are trespassing," she declared, pointing to the door. "Until a judge says otherwise, this is my home. Get out." The command was a final test of wills. If Cora left, she would be acknowledging Eleanor's authority. If she stayed, she risked being dragged out by force. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, the air thick with the potential for violence. Attorney Giddings stepped forward, raising his hand to intervene. "Mrs. Van Dorn, the will grants Miss Cora immediate possession," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "Forcibly removing her would be an illegal eviction. I must advise you to allow her to remain until the court rules." The statement was a bureaucratic grenade, stripping Eleanor of her power to command the space. The attorney's insistence on legal procedure was the only shield Cora possessed, a fragile barrier against the raw power of the white family. It was a temporary victory, bought with the credibility of a white lawyer, but it secured her physical presence on the land she now legally owned. The standoff ended not with a resolution, but with a strategic withdrawal. Silas took Eleanor by the arm, pulling her back from the precipice of a physical altercation that would damage their case. "We do not need to fight in the streets," he whispered loudly enough for the room to hear. "We have the courts. We have the judges. We have the law." He turned on his heel and marched toward the door, signaling the other witnesses to follow. "You may sleep in this house tonight, Cora," he called back over his shoulder. "But do not get comfortable. By Christmas, you will be back in the quarters, and this document will be ash." The parlor emptied, leaving Cora standing alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the heavy silence of a battle merely postponed. The war for Briarfield had been declared, and the first skirmish had ended in a draw. The formal declaration of war came swiftly on November 28, 1856, when Silas Van Dorn filed a petition in the Warren County Chancery Court to nullify the last will and testament of his brother. The document, a sprawling masterpiece of legal aggression, accused the deceased of mental incompetence and undue influence, painting a portrait of a man addled by laudanum and seduced by his own property. The filing did not merely seek to invalidate the bequests, it aimed to strip Cora Lee of the legal standing to even challenge the suit. By framing her as a manipulator rather than a beneficiary, Silas attempted to leverage the very laws that defined her as chattel to render her claim null and void. The machinery of the Southern legal system, designed to protect the sanctity of property rights, was now being weaponized to ensure that those rights remained exclusively in white hands. The social retaliation began almost immediately, orchestrated with a precision that suggested a coordinated campaign rather than organic community sentiment. Within days of the filing, Cora attempted to secure basic provisions for the main house, only to find the credit lines of Briarfield abruptly frozen. She visited the general store owned by Mr. Henderson, a merchant who had supplied the plantation for 2 decades, fully expecting to sign for the goods against the estate's ample assets. Henderson, a man who had always tipped his hat to Cornelius, refused to even look her in the eye. "I cannot extend credit to you, Miss Cora," he stammered, his gaze fixed on the ledger before him. "The account is in dispute. My other customers, well, they would not take kindly to me doing business under these circumstances." The message was unmistakable. The white merchant class of Vicksburg had closed ranks, preferring financial loss over the social risk of aiding a Negro claimant. The economic blockade extended beyond the store ledgers. When Cora attempted to hire a white overseer to manage the winter work, she was met with stony refusals. Men who had begged for employment under Cornelius now acted as if the very offer was an insult. The railroad company, in which the estate held significant stock, sent a terse letter via a courier, stating that dividend payments would be suspended pending the outcome of the litigation. The financial stranglehold was designed to starve her out, to force her to sell the land or abandon the claim simply to survive. It was a form of economic warfare that required no court order, just the silent, crushing weight of a society that refused to acknowledge her new status. Cora was legally the owner of a fortune, yet practically she was reduced to a pauper in her own home. The psychological pressure mounted as the date for the preliminary hearing approached. Eleanor Van Dorn had taken up residence in the White Wing of the house, a separate section of the mansion that had been added 10 years prior. She moved through the corridors with an air of triumphant martyrdom, accompanied by her daughter Sarah, who played the piano loudly in the evenings, as if to drown out the silence. The house was divided into 2 hostile camps, separated by thin walls and thicker hatred. Servants were forced to choose sides, delivering food to one mistress and ignoring the other, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension. The physical proximity of the antagonists made the estate a powder keg, where a glance or a slammed door could spark a conflagration that the courts could not contain. Cora soon discovered that the hostility extended to the very roads leading to Vicksburg. On her way to consult with Attorney Giddings, her carriage was forced to the side of the muddy track by a group of young white men, sons of neighboring planters, who shouted obscenities and hurled rocks at the wheels. It was a warning shot, a reminder that she had stepped outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The local sheriff, a man named Talmadge, rode by during the incident, slowed his horse to observe the scene, and then rode on without intervening. The complicity of the authorities was made clear. The law would protect property, but it would not protect the rights of a black woman who dared to claim equality. The isolation was suffocating, designed to make her feel that the entire world was against her. Yet, in the shadows of this oppression, a different kind of network began to coalesce. One rainy evening, a knock came at the back door of the kitchen house where Cora resided. Standing in the drizzle were three figures: a free black carpenter named Solomon, a seamstress named Mrs. Beatty, and a woman named Ruth, who ran a small bakery in the colored section of Vicksburg. They brought with them sacks of flour, cured hams, and a small pouch of gold coins. "The white folks may close their doors," Solomon whispered, "but we have our own keys." It was the first sign of solidarity Cora had experienced since the reading, a reminder that she was not fighting just for herself, but for the hopes of an entire community that lived in the margins. This underground support system operated with the secrecy of a guerrilla army. The free black community of Vicksburg, though small, was economically vibrant and politically aware. They understood that if Cora Lee prevailed, it would shatter the ceiling that kept all people of color in subjugation. If she failed, it would reinforce the narrative of their inferiority. Solomon offered to repair the fences and outbuildings without pay, while Mrs. Beatty took it upon herself to gather intelligence from the white families she served, reporting back on the mood in town and the rumors of Silas's legal strategy. The struggle for Briarfield had ceased to be a family dispute. It had evolved into a proxy war for the dignity of every black person in Mississippi. The stakes were raised higher when news arrived that Silas had retained the services of a special prosecutor from Jackson, a man renowned for his oratory and his staunch defense of the slave-holding hierarchy. The fee for this attorney was exorbitant, but Silas had secured loans against the anticipated values of the estate, effectively using Cornelius's own money to fight his will. This financial maneuvering was brought to Cora's attention by a clerk in the probate office, a poor white man who sympathized with the underdog, or perhaps simply enjoyed the chaos. It was a detail that underscored the overwhelming odds. The Van Dorn family had the resources of the establishment behind them, while Cora relied on the charity of those who had nothing to lose. As the winter deepened, the hearing date of early January drew near. Giddings worked tirelessly in his office, sorting through the boxes of ledgers that Cora had secretly spirited out of the main house. These books were her strongest defense, a record of her competence and her management of the estate's affairs. They proved that she was not an ignorant tool, but a skilled administrator who had kept the plantation solvent for years. The ledgers were a weapon of truth in a battle of lies, and Giddings intended to use them to dismantle the image of the helpless, manipulated concubine that Silas had constructed for the court. The night before the hearing, Cora sat by the fire with her son Nathan, explaining that the coming days would be hard and that they would hear terrible things said about their family. "They will try to shame us," she told the boy, "but shame belongs to those who do wrong, not those who survive it." It was a moment of quiet preparation for the storm that was about to break. The trial would not just be about land and money. It would be a public dissection of her life, her choices, and her humanity. As she looked at her children, the weight of the future settled on her shoulders, heavier than any burden she had carried in the fields. The morning of the preliminary hearing dawned grey and cold, the sky threatening snow. Cora dressed not in the fine silks that a woman of her new wealth might be expected to wear, but in a simple, dark wool dress that Giddings had advised would project humility and seriousness. She walked out of the kitchen house and climbed into the carriage that would take her to the courthouse. The siege of Briarfield was about to move from the parlor to the courtroom, and the entire state of Mississippi was watching. The outcome of this day would determine whether the law was a shield for justice or a sword for the powerful. The Warren County Courthouse was a crucible of anticipation on the morning of January 5th, 1857. While the temperature outside hovered near freezing, the courtroom itself was stifling, packed with a sweating, murmuring throng of planters, merchants, and curious townsfolk. The case of Van Dorn versus Lee had become the spectacle of the season, a piece of theatre where the audience felt they had a personal stake in the outcome. Judge Ambrose Clarkson, a man known for his strict adherence to protocol and his deep investment in the Southern social order, presided from the bench. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and tobacco, a pungent backdrop to the high-stakes legal drama. Cora Lee sat at the defense table beside Samuel Giddings, her hands folded tightly in her lap, a solitary figure of calm amidst a sea of hostile stares. Silas Van Dorn opened the proceedings with a flourish, his voice resonating off the high ceiling as he painted a grim picture of domestic betrayal. He stood before the jury of 12 white men, all property owners, and spoke of the sanctity of the family unit, arguing that the will was a bludgeon used to murder the reputation of a good woman. He spoke of Cornelius not as a wealthy planter, but as a victim of his own declining health and the predatory influence of those he held in bondage. The strategy was clear. Bypass the legal technicalities of the will and appeal directly to the jurors' fears. He asked them to imagine their own households, their own legacies, and the fragility of their authority should a piece of paper be allowed to overturn the natural order of things. It was an argument designed to bypass logic and strike at the heart of their identity. The prosecution called Eleanor Van Dorn to the stand as their first witness, and the room fell into a respectful hush. She walked slowly to the witness box, draped in layers of black crepe that accentuated her paleness. Her demeanor was a study in performed grief, a curated exhibition of the wronged matriarch. She testified to her 23 years of devotion, speaking of her management of the household and her assumption of the traditional burdens of a planter's wife. She described the discovery of the will as a second death, claiming that the document had stripped her of her past as effectively as the grave had claimed her husband. Her voice was steady, practiced, designed to elicit maximum sympathy from men who viewed white womanhood as the fragile cornerstone of their civilization. Under Silas's gentle guidance, Eleanor began to weave the narrative of the conspiracy. She admitted to knowing Cora Lee, referring to her not by name, but as the housekeeper, a term that dripped with condescension. She detailed the late-night sessions with the Ledgers, the strange intimacy of the household management, and her growing suspicion that her husband was being influenced by someone who should have had no voice. "I trusted my husband," she testified, her eyes welling with tears. "But I did not trust the circumstances that kept him isolated in his study, with a woman who owed him everything." It was a masterful evasion of reality, shifting the blame from Cornelius's choices to Cora's very existence, painting the enslaved woman as a usurper who had silently stolen the master's mind. The tension in the courtroom tightened when the subject of the children arose. Silas asked Eleanor directly about the paternity of Nathan, Louisa, and James. Eleanor's face hardened, her grief momentarily replaced by a flash of venomous pride. "I have no knowledge of those children's parentage," she stated, her voice cold. "They were servants in my house. I did not inquire into their origins." It was the formal, legal lie, the necessary fiction that allowed the South to function. By denying the obvious resemblance and the whispered truth, Eleanor was inviting the jury to participate in the collective amnesia that the social code demanded. She was asking them to uphold the lie, even when the truth stood staring them in the face. Samuel Giddings rose for the cross-examination, his approach cautious but surgical. He did not attack Eleanor's virtue, for that would be self-destruction in a Southern courtroom, but he attacked her knowledge. He produced the plantation ledgers from 1847, pointing out her distinctive handwriting alongside that of Cornelius and Cora. "Mrs. Van Dorn," he asked, "is it not true that you ceased handling the household accounts in late 1846? Eleanor hesitated, claiming a lack of head for figures. Giddings pressed on. "And is it not true that you did not manage the accounts because you had delegated the task to the defendant?" The implication was clear. Eleanor had known, had consented, and had benefited from the arrangement for over a decade. Giddings then shifted the timeline, forcing Eleanor to confront the duration of her silence. "You lived in this house for 11 years after the birth of the first child," he stated, his voice even. "You attended church services, you hosted dinner parties, you traveled to New Orleans. At what point during these years did you consider the defendant a threat to your marriage?" Eleanor's composure began to fray at the edges. "I considered her a servant," she snapped. "A servant does not threaten a marriage." Giddings pounced on the admission. "But a woman who bears your husband's children does," he countered. "And yet you stayed. You did not leave. You did not seek a separation. You accepted the arrangement." The defense was dismantling the image of the helpless victim, revealing instead a woman who had negotiated her own form of survival within the system. The turning point came when Giddings introduced a series of receipts signed by Eleanor herself. They were for the purchase of clothing and supplies for the servants in the big house, including fine fabric that had been used to make dresses for Louisa. "You authorized the purchase of this material?" Giddings asked. Eleanor nodded curtly. "For the household help," she clarified. "Did you not notice that these garments were being made for a child who bore a striking resemblance to your husband?" Giddings pressed. The courtroom held its breath. To answer truthfully was to admit she had known and condoned the relationship. To lie was to risk perjury. Eleanor chose the only path available to a woman of her station. She feigned ignorance, but the jury saw the cracks in the facade. The psychological toll of the cross-examination was visible in the jury box. These were men who understood the complex economy of the plantation household, where secrets were currency and ignorance was often a deliberate choice. Giddings was not proving that Eleanor was a villain, but that she was a participant in the very system she now claimed had victimized her. He was showing them that her blindness had been a convenience, a way to maintain her status and comfort, while the reality of the situation festered in the rooms below. The moral high ground she had claimed was eroding, turning into a swamp of complicity and suppressed truth. As Eleanor stepped down from the stand, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The initial wave of sympathy for the grieving widow had been replaced by a murmur of uncomfortable realization. The case was no longer a simple matter of a black woman stealing an inheritance. It was a messy, human tragedy that exposed the rot at the heart of the plantation ideal. The defense had successfully turned the trial into a mirror, forcing the white spectators to see the contradictions in their own lives reflected in the testimony of the plaintiff. The stakes had risen, for now the jury was not just deciding the fate of a fortune, but judging the integrity of the social code they all lived by. Silas Van Dorn conferred urgently with his counsel, their faces drawn and tight. The strategy of painting Cora as a seductress and Eleanor as a saint had been blunted by the simple chronology of events. They needed a new weapon, a way to recapture the narrative and shift the focus back to the impossibility of the bequest. The next phase of the trial would require them to move beyond character assassination and attack the legal standing of the defendant directly. They prepared to call the medical experts, hoping that testimony regarding Cornelius's mental state would succeed where the testimony of his widow had failed. The prosecution shifted its strategy abruptly on the second day, moving away from the emotional narrative of domestic betrayal and attempting to ground the case in medical certainty. Dr. Thaddeus Carr, a physician of considerable repute in Vicksburg, was called to the stand to discuss the clinical progression of Cornelius Van Dorn's final illness. Silas Van Dorn guided the doctor through a detailed, almost surgical recitation of the symptoms, the violent coughing fits, the persistent fever, and the dramatic weight loss. The intent was to construct a medical framework for incompetence, suggesting that the consumption had not only ravaged the body, but had also eroded the cognitive faculties necessary for drafting a complex legal instrument. The courtroom listened with a macabre fascination as the doctor described the physical toll of the disease, painting a picture of a man slowly being consumed by his own biology. Under direct examination, Dr. Carr ventured into the realm of speculation, testifying that in the advanced stages of tuberculosis, the patient often suffers from hypoxia, a deprivation of oxygen that can lead to confusion and irrational euphoria. "It is my professional opinion," Carr stated, adjusting his spectacles, "that a man in Mr. Van Dorn's condition would be highly susceptible to suggestion and unlikely to possess the clarity required for sound judgment." The testimony struck at the very heart of the will's validity. If the testator was not of sound mind, the document was worthless. The jury leaned forward, absorbing the scientific authority of the witness, while Cora Lee sat motionless, her fate hanging on the medical charts being entered into evidence. Samuel Giddings rose for the cross-examination, his demeanor that of a man dissecting a frog in a laboratory. He did not attack the doctor's credentials, but rather his proximity to the patient. "Dr. Carr," Giddings began, "how many times did you personally examine Mr. Van Dorn during the final 6 weeks of his life?" The doctor paused, shuffling his notes before admitting that he had not visited the plantation in nearly 2 months prior to the death. Giddings pressed the advantage. "Then you did not examine Mr. Van Dorn on or around October 4th, 1856, the date the will was executed." Carr was forced to concede the point, his air of authority deflating slightly under the realization that he was testifying to the mental state of a man he had not seen during the critical window. Giddings then introduced the testimony of 3 other physicians who had been present at the house during the final weeks. These doctors, hired by the defense, had signed affidavits stating that Cornelius remained lucid, articulate, and fully capable of understanding his affairs until the very end. Giddings read aloud from the affidavit of Dr. Harrison, who had attended to Cornelius on October 3rd. "The patient was weak in body, but remarkably sharp in mind," the statement read. "We discussed the implications of the railroad expansion and the cotton market. He exhibited no signs of delirium." The contradiction in medical opinions created a fog of uncertainty, but the defense had successfully established that the prosecution's medical expert was relying on generalities rather than specific observation. The prosecution attempted to salvage their medical argument by suggesting that the sheer irrationality of the will was proof of incompetence. "No rational man," Silas argued, "would disinherit his own flesh and blood in favor of a negress. The act itself is evidence of a disordered mind." It was a circular argument that appealed to the prejudices of the time, conflating social abnormality with legal insanity. Judge Clarkson scribbled notes furiously, his expression unreadable. The defense objected to the characterization of the bequest as irrational, arguing that the law allowed a man to dispose of his property as he saw fit, regardless of whether the court approved of his sentiments. The legal battleground was shifting from the physical health of the testator to the interpretation of his motives. Following the medical testimony, the trial moved into the realm of household dynamics, with the prosecution calling a series of white employees and lower-level servants to testify regarding Cora's influence. The most damaging of these was the estate's former overseer, a man named Mr. Pritchard, who had been dismissed by Cornelius a year prior for mismanagement. Pritchard testified that Cora had free run of the house, and that he had often seen her in the master's study with the door closed. He insinuated that she used her position to poison the master's mind against his legitimate family, painting a picture of a domestic coup d'etat. The testimony was laced with innuendo, designed to play on the jury's deepest fears of black women wielding power over white men. Giddings cross-examined Pritchard with a ruthless precision, exposing the man's grudge against his former employer. "You were fired for stealing supplies from the commissary, were you not?" Giddings asked. Pritchard denied the charge, but Giddings produced the ledger entries documenting the theft, entries written in Cora's precise hand. "The woman you accuse of manipulation was the one who caught you stealing," Giddings declared, turning to the jury. "Is it possible that your testimony is motivated by a desire for revenge against the woman who exposed your crimes?" The overseer stammered and sweated, his credibility crumbling as the defense revealed that Cora had not manipulated the master, but had in fact served as the guardian of his estate's integrity. The most pivotal witness for the defense, however, was not a doctor or a lawyer, but an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Delilah, who had served as the plantation midwife for 40 years. Her testimony was a rarity in a Southern court, as enslaved people were generally barred from testifying against whites, but she was called to corroborate facts regarding the birth of the children, a point the defense was not contesting. Silas Van Dorn objected strenuously, but Judge Clarkson allowed her to speak, limiting her testimony to the physical reality of the births. Delilah walked to the stand on trembling legs, her face a map of hardship and survival, and her presence silenced the room. Delilah's voice was low, but carried the weight of undeniable truth. She confirmed that Nathan, Louisa, and James were the children of Cornelius Van Dorn, describing the births and the master's presence in the room. "Master Cornelius held those babies," she said simply. "He gave them his name in his heart, even if the law wouldn't let him write it." She looked directly at the jury when she spoke, her eyes clear and steady. "He wasn't manipulated. He was a man doing what he thought was right by his blood, even if it was too late." The simplicity of her statement cut through the complex legal posturing like a knife. It stripped away the narrative of the seductress and revealed the raw, human reality of a father trying to protect his children. The emotional impact of Delilah's testimony was profound. The jury, composed of men who were likely fathers themselves, were confronted with the humanity of the defendant and her children. The prosecution's attempts to paint Cora as a scheming property owner were undermined by the image of a mother and a midwife navigating the brutal realities of slavery. The defense had successfully shifted the narrative from a legal dispute over land to a moral dispute over obligation. By acknowledging the paternity, they forced the court to decide whether a father's duty to his children extended to those born in chains. The day ended with the defense resting its case on the facts of the relationship. The medical testimony had been neutralized, and the character assassination had been blunted by the exposure of the prosecution's witnesses' biases. The trial was now poised on a knife's edge, with the central question being not whether Cornelius was sane, but whether his sanity was sufficient to override the social order. The stage was set for the final decisive piece of evidence, the words of the dead man himself. The courtroom hummed with a tense anticipation on the morning of January 9th, 1857. As the defense prepared to call its final witness. Samuel Giddings stood slowly, his age showing in the stiffness of his movements, and announced that he would be testifying himself. This procedural rarity, a serving attorney taking the stand, sent a ripple of murmurs through the packed gallery. Giddings was not just a lawyer. He was the architect of the disputed document, the last man to speak at length with Cornelius Van Dorn. His testimony promised to bridge the gap between the cold paper of the wills and the living intent of the dead man. Silas Van Dorn objected on grounds of professional impropriety, but Judge Clarkson overruled him, noting that the attorney's first-hand knowledge was central to the question of competence. Giddings took the oath with a solemn gravity, his hand trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of the secret he had carried for months. He produced a small, leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket, which he identified as the contemporaneous notes taken during his 2 days of dictation with Cornelius. The prosecution had argued that the will was the product of a fevered mind, but Giddings's notes offered a minute-by-minute rebuttal. He read aloud the timestamps and the specific instructions regarding the complex trust structures, detailing how Cornelius had corrected a mathematical error in the projected cotton yields. This was not the scrawling of a lunatic, but the meticulous calculation of a man protecting his assets. The courtroom fell silent as the dry legal jargon transformed into proof of a razor-sharp intellect. The turning point came when Giddings reached into his satchel and withdrew a sealed envelope, the wax stamped with the Van Dorn crest. "This document," Giddings announced, his voice cracking, "was entrusted to me by Mr. Van Dorn on October 4th, 1856. He instructed me to open it only in the event that his will was contested." The envelope was passed to the judge, who broke the seal and scanned the contents. Judge Clarkson's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or deep weariness, crossed his eyes. He nodded to Giddings, allowing the letter to be read into the official record. It was the dead man's final defense, delivered from beyond the grave. Giddings began to read the letter, his voice gaining strength as he translated Cornelius's private agony into public record. "I write this to you, Samuel, so that there may be no mistake as to my intentions," the letter began. "I know that my family will fight this. They will say I was mad, or that I was beguiled, but the truth is far simpler and far more damning." The words hung in the air, a confession that stripped away the genteel fiction of the Southern planter. Cornelius admitted that he had purchased Cora Lee with the intention of using her skills, but that over a decade his reliance had turned into a profound, if illicit, attachment. He acknowledged the power dynamic, calling his initial actions theft of her person, and admitting that his subsequent affection did not absolve the original sin. "Who is property cannot seduce. She can, who is property cannot seduce. She can only submit or suffer. I was the master. I was the one who held the whip, even if I never raised my hand. The crime is mine, not hers." The language was brutal and unflinching, a stark departure from the flowery eulogies offered at his funeral. The white jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, forced to confront the reality of the power dynamics they all wielded. It was a damning indictment not just of Cornelius, but of the entire system that allowed such a relationship to exist. Giddings paused, drinking a glass of water, before reading the most critical passage regarding the children. "I have 3 children, Nathan, Louisa, and James, who are currently enslaved on my own land," the letter stated. "I have watched them grow, bright and beautiful, knowing that by the laws of this state they are nothing more than livestock. I cannot die with that lie unchallenged. I have been a coward all my life, Samuel, hiding behind the conventions of our society. But I refuse to meet my Maker, having left my own flesh and blood in chains." The admission of paternity was absolute and legally binding. It destroyed the prosecution's claim that Cora was an outsider stealing the legacy. She was the mother of the heir, and the will was an act of paternal duty. Silas Van Dorn leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage, objecting that the letter was self-serving hearsay. "A man cannot write his own sanity into existence," he shouted. But the legal logic of the letter worked against him. The document was not a legal brief, but a personal testament, replete with details about family history and private conversations that only the true Cornelius could have known. Judge Clarkson overruled the objection, captivated by the narrative unfolding in his courtroom. The letter was not just evidence. It was a self-destruction note of the soul, a man dismantling his own reputation to secure a fragment of justice. The final section of the letter addressed the financial disparity directly. "My white children will inherit their mother's name, their white skin, and the protection of this society." Cornelius's voice echoed through the room. "They will have doors opened to them that my children with Cora will never pass through. The money I leave to Cora and the little ones is not a gift. It is a feeble attempt to level a playing field that I helped to tilt." It was a sophisticated economic argument, acknowledging that in the capitalist hierarchy of the South, capital was the only shield available to people of color. The will was not an act of passion, but a calculated transfer of power to those who had none. When Giddings finished reading, the silence that descended was absolute. The prosecution had no witnesses to rebut a dead man. The elaborate house of cards Silas had built, blaming the illness, blaming the seductress, blaming the confusion, had been swept away by the hurricane of Cornelius's honesty. The jurors looked at the plaintiff's table, where Eleanor Van Dorn sat with her head bowed, her previous performance of the grieving widow now tainted by the reality of her husband's rejection. The dynamic in the room had inverted. The defense was no longer asking for permission, but demanding accountability. On cross-examination, Silas tried to bully Giddings, insinuating that the attorney had helped draft the letter to ensure his own fees. "Did you not profit from the drafting of this will, Mr. Giddings?" Silas sneered. Giddings met the attack with a cold stare. "I am being paid the standard rate for probate work," he replied evenly. "But I would have done this work for free, Mr. Van Dorn, because your brother asked me to help him do the only right thing he had ever done." The verbal slap stunned the court. Giddings had effectively called out the prosecution's greed, contrasting it with the moral imperative driving the defense. The defense rested its case with the echo of that letter, lingering in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The evidence was complete. The trial had moved from a dispute over property lines to a referendum on the conscience of a dead man, and by extension, the conscience of the community that had enabled him. The attorneys prepared for their closing arguments, but everyone in the room, from the judge to the bailiff, knew that the verdict would hinge on whether the jury was willing to honor the brutal truth of Cornelius Van Dorn's final confession. The legal arguments were over. The moral judgment was about to begin. The closing arguments were delivered on January 12, 1857. Under a sky the color of iron, Silas Van Dorn spoke first, abandoning the subtleties of medical testimony for a raw appeal to the jury's survival instincts. He stood before the 12 men, his voice rising to a thunderous pitch, warning that upholding the will would unleash chaos upon the state. "If you validate this document," he bellowed, "you tell every planter in Mississippi that his legacy is not his own. You tell every Negro in the quarters that they need only seduce a master to steal a birthright." He framed the case as a defense of the civilization itself, urging the jury to look past the dead man's guilt and protect the living structure of white supremacy. It was an argument designed to terrify, bypassing law to strike at the heart of their fears. Samuel Giddings rose for the defense, his demeanor a stark contrast to Silas's fire and brimstone. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, forcing the jury to lean in to hear him. He did not ask them to like the will, nor did he ask them to approve of Cornelius's life. He asked them to respect the law. "The right to dispose of one's property is the most sacred right a citizen possesses," Giddings argued. "If you deny Cornelius Van Dorn the right to give his land to Cora Lee, you are denying the very foundation of property ownership. You are saying the state knows better than the owner." He reminded them that the law did not require them to be moral arbiters of the soul, merely executors of the written word. It was a dry, legalistic shield against the emotional onslaught they had just endured. Judge Ambrose Clarkson delivered his charge to the jury with a heavy heart, his instructions a labyrinth of legal tightropes. He acknowledged the overwhelming evidence of Cornelius's mental acuity, effectively taking the incompetence claim off the table. However, he also instructed them to consider whether the bequest violated the public policy of Mississippi. A vague, dangerous directive that granted the jury license to override the law if they found the outcome too socially destabilizing. The jury retired to deliberate at 2:00 in the afternoon, leaving the courtroom in a state of suspended animation. Cora sat rigid in her seat, her eyes fixed on the door through which the 12 men had vanished, knowing that her future rested in the hands of men who owned people like her. The deliberations lasted only 4 hours, a surprisingly short time for a decision of this magnitude, suggesting that the jury had quickly coalesced around a compromise. When the knock came from the jury room, the bailiff announced the verdict, and the crowd surged back into the stifling chamber. The foreman, a gruff farmer from the northern part of the county, stood and delivered the finding. "We find the will valid in its execution and the testator of sound mind," he stated clearly. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a smattering of shocked whispers. Cora's grip on the edge of the table tightened, her knuckles turning white, but she did not exhale. She knew the conditionality of the victory was coming. Judge Clarkson took the verdict and nodded grimly, preparing to deliver the judgment that would define his career. "It is the order of this court," he began, "that the will be admitted to probate." He paused, letting the weight of the decision settle before driving the wedge home. "However, this court finds that the transfer of the entire estate to the defendant is contrary to the statutory limitations on property ownership by persons of color in the state of Mississippi." He invoked the spirit of the law over the letter, a judicial sleight of hand that allowed him to uphold the document while gutting its intent. The courtroom erupted in shouts, forcing the bailiff to pound his gavel for order as the judge continued his pronouncement. Judge Clarkson detailed the Solomonic division of the estate with clinical detachment. "Cora Lee is granted her freedom, effective immediately," he ruled. "Furthermore, the children, Nathan, Louisa, and James, are hereby declared free persons." This was the undeniable victory, the breakage of chains that no appeal could easily restore. "Regarding the property," the judge continued, The defendant shall receive the north tract of Briarfield, comprising approximately 800 acres, along with the sum of $50,000 to be held in trust. It was a fortune by any measure, a legacy that would have been unthinkable for a former slave just days prior. Yet, it was a fraction of the empire Cornelius had intended. The judge's gavel fell on the final, brutal stipulation. The remainder of the estate, including the South Tract, the Vicksburg properties, and the railroad interests, shall pass to the lawful heirs, Eleanor Van Dorn and her children. The judge paused, his voice hardening as he addressed the disposition of the labor force. Furthermore, this court finds it unconscionable for a former slave to hold dominion over others. The enslaved workforce currently residing at Briarfield shall not pass to the defendant. They shall be sold at public auction to settle the debts of the estate and the costs of this litigation. The words struck Cora like a physical blow. She had won her freedom and her land, but she was powerless to save the community she had lived beside for a decade. Cora turned to Giddings, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. The victory was immense. She was a landowner, her children were safe, and she was rich. But the cost was equally immense. The people she had worked with, the families she had watched grow, were to be sold off like cattle. "Can we appeal?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Giddings looked at her with sad eyes. "We can," he said softly, "but we risk losing everything. The judge has given you the maximum the law allows. A higher court may not be so generous." The legal reality was that Judge Clarkson had crafted a ruling that was appeal-proof. He had validated the white family's claims enough to satisfy them, while granting enough to Cora to make risking an appeal a dangerous gamble. Across the aisle, Eleanor Van Dorn sat in stunned silence. She had not won the war, but she had survived it. The South Tract was hers. The bulk of the fortune was secured for her white children, and her rival had been cut down to size. Silas urged her to appeal, to fight for the whole, but Eleanor raised a hand to silence him. She looked across at Cora, and for the first time, the hatred in her eyes was replaced by a weary recognition. She saw a woman who had also been broken by the system, a woman who had won a battle only to lose the peace. "No more," Eleanor said quietly. "We have enough. Let it end." The final act of the drama played out in the logistics of the division. The court appointed a receiver to oversee the auction of the enslaved workforce. Families that had lived together for generations were separated in the name of legal equity. Cora watched from the porch of the North Tract house as the wagons carried her neighbors away, a procession of human misery that served as the price of her freedom. She had escaped the auction block herself, but she had been forced to step over the bodies of her friends to do it. The moral thesis of the trial had been proven. There was no justice in the antebellum South that did not come wrapped in a shroud. By the spring of 1857, the physical separation of Briarfield was complete. A fence line was erected across the property, a jagged scar across the landscape that marked the boundary between the Van Dorns and the Lees. Cora moved her children into the smaller, drafty house on the North Tract, a home that was hers by law, but felt haunted by the compromise that had secured it. Eleanor retreated to the big house on the South Tract, her victory Pyrrhic, her legacy secure, but her family's reputation forever stained by the public airing of their secrets. The two women lived out their lives in sight of one another, bound together by the man who had destroyed them both, separated only by a thin line of trees and a thick wall of silence. The case was closed, but the wound it left on the land would fester for generations. The rigid social membrane that had encapsulated Briarfield began to dissolve almost immediately after the court's final decree in the spring of 1857. Cora Lee moved her children, Nathan, Louisa, and James, into the modest farmhouse on the North Tract, a structure that lacked the grand columns of the main house, but offered something far more potent: the silence of autonomy. For the first time in her 33 years, Cora closed a door and locked it from the inside, a small mechanical act that carried the weight of a cosmic shift. Yet, the victory was geographical, not social. The white merchants of Vicksburg continued their silent embargo, forcing Cora to rely on the underground network of free black tradesmen who delivered goods under the cover of dusk. The North Tract became an island, separated from the mainland of society by a moat of prejudice and legal compromise. While Cora built her isolated sanctuary, Eleanor Van Dorn struggled to maintain the facade of the old order in the big house on the South Tract. The plantation economy, reliant on the brutal efficiency of the enslaved workforce that had been sold off to settle the estate's debts, was crippled. Eleanor found herself a landowner without the labor to work the land, a hollow matriarch ruling over empty fields. Her remaining enslaved servants viewed her with a sullen, watchful silence, aware that the sale of their peers had been the price of her settlement. The grand parlors, once filled with the elite of Vicksburg society, grew dusty and quiet as neighbors subtly distanced themselves from the woman whose family secrets had become a public scandal. The wealth she had fought to preserve became a gilded cage, isolating her in a rapidly changing world. The nation's trajectory soon overtook the local squabbles of Warren County. With the election of Lincoln and the ensuing secession of Mississippi in 1861, the fragile peace of Briarfield shattered under the weight of history. Cora's son, Nathan, now a young man of 15, watched the mustering of Confederate troops with a hatred that burned cold and bright. Unlike the white boys who rode off to defend the lost cause, Nathan saw the war as an apocalypse necessary to cleanse the land. By 1863, when Union gunboats steamed past Vicksburg, the North Tract became a crucial, if secret, way station for intelligence. Cora, risking the seizure of her hard-won land, allowed her home to be used as a stop on the informal networks feeding information to the federal forces, trading on her precarious position to aid the destruction of the institution that had birthed her fortune. The war ravaged the landscape, stripping the South Tract of its fences and burning the cotton fields. Eleanor, aging rapidly under the stress of bombardment and deprivation, was forced to flee Vicksburg during the siege, leaving the big house vulnerable to looters. When she returned in the summer of 1865, she found her world irrevocably broken. The grand house was standing but gutted, the fields were overgrown with wild plants, and the economy that had sustained her class was dead. In the midst of this ruin, she encountered a sight that encapsulated her defeat: Nathan Lee, the son of Cora and Cornelius, walking up the drive in the uniform of a Union sergeant. He was not a slave returning to beg for work. He was a conqueror returning to claim his patrimony, the inheritor of the new order. The end of the war brought a legal reaffirmation of the 1857 settlement, but the reality on the ground had shifted. The compromise of the court was rendered moot by the 13th Amendment, which finally accomplished what Cornelius's will had only attempted: the liberation of every human being on both tracts. Cora, now in her 40s, found herself navigating the treacherous waters of Reconstruction. She used her capital to establish a school for freedmen on the North Tract, employing her own literacy as a weapon against the ignorance enforced by the old laws. The land became a beacon for the community, a tangible proof that black ownership was possible, even in the heart of the defeated Confederacy. Yet, the isolation remained. The white community, beaten but not humbled, treated her with a sullen avoidance that was nearly as oppressive as open hostility. One afternoon in the spring of 1867, a moment of quiet symmetry occurred that historians would later note as the closing of the circle. Eleanor, now a gray-haired widow, was returning from a trip to the county seat in a dilapidated carriage on the muddy road between the two tracts. Her path crossed with Cora, who was walking with her daughter Louisa. The two women, the widows of Cornelius Van Dorn, one by law, one by life, stopped and regarded each other. The hatred that had fueled the courtroom battles had dissipated, replaced by the exhaustion of survival. Eleanor offered a curt, stiff nod. Cora returned the gesture with equal dignity. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They had both survived the man who had destroyed them, and they were both living in the ruins of his legacy. Eleanor Van Dorn died in the winter of 1872, in the same room where Cornelius had dictated his confession. Her children, having no desire to remain in the fallen South, sold the South Tract to a carpetbagger syndicate for a fraction of its antebellum value and scattered to the winds. William to Texas, Sarah to Charleston, the others absorbed into the anonymity of the post-war diaspora. The physical link between the white Van Dorns and the soil of Briarfield was severed. The big house, once the temple of a cotton kingdom, passed into the hands of strangers, its history stripped of the family name, reduced to just another piece of real estate in a conquered territory. Cora Lee lived on for another 2 decades, a matriarch in the truest sense of the word. She saw her children marry and prosper in ways that the 1857 court could never have legislated. Nathan became a prominent figure in local politics during Reconstruction. Louisa married a minister and moved to Philadelphia. James studied law in Ohio. Cora remained on the North Tract, tending to the land that had been bought with her dignity and sold for her children's freedom. When she finally passed in the winter of 1891, at the age of 67, her will divided the property among her 7 grandchildren, ensuring that the legacy would continue to branch outward. She was buried on a small rise behind the farmhouse, under a live oak tree, the owner of the soil that held her. It was during the cleaning of Cora's personal effects after her funeral that the final piece of the puzzle was discovered. Tucked into the back of a cedar chest, wrapped in a quilt that had been stitched by Aunt Delilah, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were the correspondence Cornelius had sent to Cora over their decade and a half of enforced silence. Notes passed in ledgers, letters slipped under doors, the fragmented confessions of a man who could not speak his heart aloud. The letters detailed his torment, his hatred of the system he benefited from, and his desperate hope that the money he left would serve as a down payment on a soul he feared he had lost. One letter, dated just weeks before his death, laid bare the moral calculus that had driven the will. "I am leaving you the land, Cora," he wrote, "because land cannot be unmade, money can be spent, and reputations can be destroyed, but the earth endures. I want you to own a piece of the world that owned you. It is a paltry vengeance, but it is all I have to offer." The letters were subsequently preserved by the family, eventually finding their way to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in the 20th century. They serve as the definitive rebuttal to the courtroom arguments of Silas Van Dorn, a testament to the fact that the will was not the act of a madman, but the final, desperate strategy of a man trying to subvert the system he had served. The story of Briarfield does not end with the death of the protagonists, nor with the discovery of the letters. The North Tract remains in the possession of Cora's descendants to this day, a rare continuity in a region defined by dispossession. The land serves as a quiet monument to a legal anomaly that managed to outlive the system it challenged. The echoes of the trial, the siege, and the quiet compromise continue to resonate in the lives of the families that sprang from Cornelius Van Dorn's dual legacy. The North Tract stands as proof that while the courts of Mississippi could limit the scope of justice, they could not extinguish the seed of truth planted by a dying man's conscience. The past is never truly dead. It simply waits in the deed books and the family trees, waiting for us to read the fine print.